Well, the whole Grand Canyon thing is bananas. Like, there's areas of the Grand Canyon you cannot explore.
You cannot go. You cannot fly over.
Right.
And you can't fly under the rim. Yet when you go to those bad places, suddenly a white plane flies over under the rim, black helicopters show up. I showed it in my episode. I show the black helicopters showing up. Like, they do show.
Yeah.
A discovery made inside the Grand Canyon has reopened an argument about where our species actually came from. And it challenges almost everything we were taught about history. Out of every national park and famous landscape on Earth, the Grand Canyon is the one almost everybody knows. The size of it, the beauty of it, the sheer strangeness of the rock. Tourists, explorers, and scientists have never been able to look away from it. But when it came up on Joe Rogan's podcast, he started asking the questions no one is willing to ask.
Grand Canyon, there's been these crazy stories of people finding these like Egyptian, these caverns with like Egyptian artwork and hieroglyphics and these stories of artifacts that have been removed from there.
The Grand Canyon is not what we were told. Something's hidden there. And by the end of this video, you will understand why nobody is allowed to go and look. The time that is missing from the rock. Before the caves, before any of it, you have to understand that the canyon itself is already wrong. The walls read like the pages of a book. Layer on layer of stone, each one a slice of time, running deeper and older the further down you look. That is how the record is supposed to work. Except in the Grand Canyon, the pages do not run in order. There is a line in that rock where the layers above and the layers below simply do not connect. Scientists call it the Great Unconformity, and it is a boundary between two enormous sets of rock that should have hundreds of millions of years of history sitting between them. That history is not there. Ancient stone at the bottom. Far younger stone laid directly on top of it. And between the two, a gap of time so vast that our own history books say it should not be possible. Something removed hundreds of millions of years of the planet's record from this exact place and left the two ends pressed together like a book with the middle torn out. Stand at the right spot on the canyon wall and you can put your hand across that line. Below your fingers, rock over 1 billion years old. Above them, rock hundreds of millions of years younger. Nothing in between. No transition, no gradual shift. Just two eras of the planet touching each other directly. Nobody has ever fully explained what did that. But there is one answer that keeps coming back, and it is not a gentle one. The flood theory. It comes from Graham Hancock, and it is the reason his name is attached to this canyon at all. Hancock argues that something planetary did this. A massive freezing of the Earth or a flood on a scale big enough to rip one layer off and start stacking the next. Water. Not a river doing patient work over millions of years, but a flood so large it is genuinely hard to picture. Enough force to tear away whole layers of rock and carry them off, leaving nothing behind but the ancient floor and whatever settled on it afterwards. The wearing away needed to do that would have to be more violent than anything happening on Earth today. And there is something in the rock that fits that idea uncomfortably well. The Grand Canyon is full of fossils. Enormous numbers of them, in places packed together in ways that do not look like the slow, quiet dying of ordinary time. Some researchers describe them as casualties, things that were alive and then very suddenly were not. Other researchers argue for something slower and less dramatic, pointing to the ancient breaking apart of a giant landmass and the enormous earthquakes that came with it, grinding rock away and carrying it off over huge stretches of time. That argument is still running. So the canyon opens with a mystery before you ever go inside it. A place missing its own past, holding the remains of whatever died when that past disappeared. So this is a place that has already lost its own past, which makes it exactly the kind of place where somebody else's past could be hidden too. But who is Graham Hancock, and why does his opinion on a rock face carry any weight at all? The man who cracked it. He came out of journalism before he turned to prehistoric mysteries and lost civilizations, and he has written a shelf of books laying out his theories. The academic world calls him a pseudo-archaeologist for it, and they do not mean it kindly. But whatever label you put on him, he has a real gift for looking at evidence everybody else has already walked past and asking the question nobody bothered to ask. He has spent years arguing that a lost civilization stood behind the pyramids and other ancient structures, and that we have badly underrated how far back real skill goes. He does not get into most of these places in person. He works from research, from records, and from the accounts of the people who were actually there. But the only reason most people have heard any of this is the room he has been saying it in. Hancock has laid the whole argument out on Joe Rogan's podcast in front of an audience larger than most television networks reach. Joe Rogan is not an archaeologist and has never claimed to be. His role here is simpler and, in a way, more useful. He is the one asking the obvious question out loud, in public, and refusing to accept the answer he is given. But neither of them was the first person to look at this canyon and feel that the official story was too small for it. The first man down. Long before Hancock and Joe Rogan, there was John Wesley Powell. He went into the canyon when it was not a national park, when it was not protected, and when almost nobody cared what was in it at all. He was not looking for gold. He was pulled in by the strange rocks themselves, and against considerable odds, he worked it out. He figured out that most of that canyon had been carved by water across an immense span of time, which is still the answer we teach today. But he understood one more thing, and it is the thing that matters here. Those rock layers were holding critical information about our own past. They were a kind of time machine, and nobody had read them yet. Powell read the rock. The next man to go down there found something the rock could not explain. The last expedition. His name was G.E. Kincaid, and he is the man Joe Rogan keeps returning to whenever this subject comes up. By every account, he was a daredevil, the sort who would go to any length to reach the real edge of a place. The timing of what he did is important. Word had reached him that the Grand Canyon was about to be closed off and protected, which meant free access to it was ending. So Kincaid decided to make one final trip while he still could. He took a boat down the Colorado River and into the canyon alone. At that time, the region was known to be rich in minerals and gold, and that was reason enough for a man like him to be there. He worked the river, watching the walls. Then something on the rock face caught his attention, high above the water. He pulled the boat in and went the rest of the way on foot. Understand what that decision meant. He was alone, deep in a canyon nobody was watching, with no way to call for help, and nobody who knew where he was. There was no trail, no path anybody had cut. He had nothing to follow but his own instincts and whatever he thought he had seen. And a little way up that wall, he found something that no river, no wind, and no rockfall has ever made. The steps. Steps, cut into the rock, going up. Not a rockfall that happened to stack conveniently. Worked stone, shaped by hands, leading somewhere. And here is the decision that has kept this story alive for over 100 years. Kincaid did not turn round and go for help. He did not report it to any authority. He did not wait for daylight or witnesses or a second pair of eyes. He climbed them alone. He counted them as he went, worked stone under his boots, hundreds of feet above the river, in a canyon where the record says nobody ever built anything. At the top of those steps, set back into the cliff face, he came to the mouth of a passage running into the rock, wide enough to walk into, cut square. He went inside. Nobody knows how long he was in there. What is on record is that he came back out with an account so detailed that people have spent over 100 years trying to check it and failing to reach it. And the first thing he described is the reason they keep trying. What was on the walls? The first thing he found inside were the markings, symbols and hieroglyphics carved into the stone, and by his own account, he could not explain a single one of them. They were not the work of any local tribe he knew of. They looked to him like something from the other side of the world. That is the detail that has always made this hard to dismiss cleanly. He did not write down Egyptian, he wrote down strange. Familiar in shape and wrong in every particular, close to something he recognized and not quite it. Because a man inventing a lost Egyptian city writes Egyptian. He does not invent a near miss and then struggle to describe it. There was more than writing. He described a statue set in the rock, seated cross-legged, holding what he took to be a flower, with a face that struck him as closer to a Buddha than anything Egyptian and not quite human either. And past the carvings, the passage kept going, deeper into the cliff than any cave has a right to run. That is where it stopped being a cave at all. The rooms. The passage opened into chambers, and the chambers had been built. Rooms cut back into the rock on both sides of a main corridor, arranged in a way Kincaid thought was planned, not natural. He noted openings near the ceilings that he assumed were there for ventilation, because air was moving through a place buried deep inside a cliff. Then he measured the walls. They were over 3 feet thick. Nobody cuts 3 feet of solid rock by accident. That is not shelter someone found. That is construction. Somebody decided how thick those walls needed to be and then did the work. There were things stored in those rooms. He described metal tools hardened in a way he could not explain. Weapons, shields stacked along the walls, vessels and grain stores, as though a population had walked out one day and left its household behind. He moved through room after room, and the questions started piling up faster than he could answer them. What tribe built this? What civilization? How did they cut it? How did they live here? And where in the name of anything did they go? So he kept going, room after room, deeper in. And then he walked into one chamber near the back of it. And everything else he had seen that day stopped mattering. The chamber. What was in that room is the reason people are still arguing about the Grand Canyon in the 21st century, and the reason Joe Rogan cannot leave the story alone. Bodies. Bodies kept from rotting, laid out and wrapped, resting inside a chamber cut into the rock hundreds of feet above the Colorado River. Not one. Enough of them that the room read as a burial place. Everything before this could be argued away. Odd markings might be misread. Rooms might be natural formations a hopeful man read too kindly. Steps could be a trick of erosion. You cannot misread a mummy. He described them in detail, the wrapping, the way they were laid out, the care in how they had been placed. This was not a man stumbling over old bones in a hole. This was a man standing in a tomb. This was the final thing Kincaid, or anyone who came after him, needed in order to say that human beings had genuinely lived and died inside these caves. Somebody had carried their dead down into that rock, prepared them, and left them there. So the question stopped being whether anyone had been there. It became who they were, how long ago they lived, what kind of life they had inside a rock face in the desert, and why every trace of them has vanished from the record we are allowed to see. And it turns out somebody has been answering that question for a very long time. The people of one heart. There is an old story told along the Colorado River, and it has been told a very long time. Certain tribes have always treated parts of this canyon as a holy site, and the people who live along the river still pass down accounts of what once happened here. The clearest of them comes from the Hopi of northeastern Arizona. The story goes that long ago the people were divided into two kinds, the people of one heart and the people of two hearts. And as time went on, the trouble between them grew worse until it could not be contained. So the chief, a man named Macheto, told the people of one heart to leave, and they went down into the lands below. Now sit that story beside a burial chamber cut into the wall of a canyon in a place nobody can explain, holding the remains of people who are on no record anywhere. And there is a further question the story does not answer, which is how anybody survived down there at all. The caves are vast, but a cave is not a farm. Feeding a population inside a rock wall in a desert with a river hundreds of feet below you is a genuinely difficult problem. Whoever lived there solved it somehow, and we have no idea how. The Hopi have been saying somebody went down there for longer than the United States has existed. So the place got a name, and that name comes with the detail that explains everything that followed. Kincaid Citadel. The place got a name. Kincaid Citadel, after the man who found it. And its location is the single most important fact in this entire story because it explains 100 years of failure. The entrance sits roughly 1,486 feet down a steep wall of the Grand Canyon. That is not somewhere you wander past. It is not reachable on foot, and it is not reachable by casual climbing. To get to that opening, you need rope, equipment, training, and a very good reason to be hanging off a cliff face in the middle of a protected wilderness, which is precisely why it has never been rediscovered by an ordinary hiker with a camera. Every casual searcher who has gone looking for Kincaid's cave over the last century has been looking in places a person can actually get to. The account says it is not in one of those places. Kincaid knew exactly what he had, so he did the right thing. He wrote it all down, and he sent it to the biggest science body in the country. And that is where this stops being one man's story. The expedition that never finished. He wrote to the Smithsonian laying out everything he had found, hoping they would take it seriously enough to fund a proper investigation. They did. An expedition was mounted, led by Kincaid alongside a Smithsonian man named Professor S.A. Jordan, with the aim of settling the question completely. Find the truth about this underground place and the civilization that had lived in it. Over the course of that expedition, a serious team assembled. Workers, experts, people brought in to do the job properly. And they were finding things. Artifact after artifact came out of that rock, and each one said the same thing, that whoever had lived down there was far more advanced than anybody had allowed for. The pieces started adding up. Researchers began forming real theories about how these people had lived. It genuinely looked like the mystery was about to be solved. And then, just as the team was reaching the peak of the whole investigation, something shocking happened. Every single artifact and every single mummy that had been sent on to the Smithsonian vanished. This is the part Joe Rogan keeps flagging. There are stories of artifacts being removed from that canyon, but these artifacts are nowhere for anyone to look at. Not misplaced. Gone. And when Kincaid went to ask what had happened to the things he had pulled out of that cave with his own hands, he was shut down. No answer. Fingers pointed in every direction, and none of them landed anywhere. And then it got stranger still. Both men disappear. Kincaid and Jordan, the two men leading the entire investigation, disappeared. Not one of them. Both. The explorer who found the place and the scientist sent to check his story, gone at the same time with no explanation that anybody has ever been able to produce. Nobody could account for it then, and nobody can account for it now. Consider how strange that is on its own. One man disappearing is a tragedy or a scandal or a coward running from a lie, he told. Two men disappearing from opposite ends of the same project at the same moment is something else entirely. The team that had gathered around them fell apart. The workers and experts drifted away one by one. The whole thing fell apart, and the investigation into the biggest archaeological claim in American history simply ended in the middle. And the questions that came out of that have never been answered. Were they stopped because the caves were genuinely dangerous? Or was there something inside them that somebody decided the public was never going to see? The government never gave any explanation at all. One minute those caves were open ground. The next, armed men in black were walking the place, keeping everybody off it. There are people who believe the government had a hand in it. That is a serious charge, and there is no proof of it. But the pattern is difficult to ignore. Because from that point onward, everything about this place gets harder to reach, not easier. The land gets protected, the airspace gets restricted, the area gets closed, and the body that once agreed to look into it spends the next century saying there was never anything to look into. But the curiosity never died. Men like Graham Hancock picked the question back up and have been trying to settle it ever since, going after exactly the places other people will not touch. And one detail from that cave in particular refuses to go quietly. The Egypt problem. There is one part of Kincaid's account that refuses to sit quietly, and it is the hieroglyphics. The symbols he described on those walls look like the writing of ancient Egypt, not loosely. Closely enough that every person who has looked at the account has been forced to deal with it. This is one of the details Joe Rogan fixes on when the subject comes up, because the objects described did not match anything on the known record. Not Native American, as you would expect from that landscape, Egyptian or Tibetan. And if that is true, even partly, then it points at something that ought to be impossible. It would mean a relationship of some kind between the people who lived in that canyon and a civilization on the other side of the planet, thousands of years before anyone is supposed to have crossed that ocean. Consider what the Egyptians were doing at the time. They were raising structures we still cannot fully account for. Experts who study the pyramids agree the building work and the skill involved are staggering, and nobody has settled how it was managed with the tools of that era. Most of the stones in them weigh several tons each, and the question of how those blocks were cut, moved, and placed has never been closed. So we have one civilization doing the impossible in Egypt, and markings that look like theirs carved into a cliff in Arizona. Connecting those two places sounds mad at first. It is thousands of miles and a whole ocean too far. But the alternative is to argue that a man in 1909, describing a cave nobody had ever seen, invented a detail that just happens to open the single biggest unanswered question in ancient history. And some people in the scientific community have pointed at the government over exactly this. If proof of that link existed and it caused enough trouble, would the records simply be allowed to disappear? 90 years later, two people decided to stop asking and go and look. The couple who found the door. Their names were Jerry and Kathy Wills. They gave it 3 years, not a weekend with a rope. 3 years of research and searching, working the canyon, cross-checking the old account against the rock, trying to find an entrance a man had described 90 years earlier and nobody had seen since. They did it knowing the area was off-limits and knowing what that meant if they were caught. And they found it. 1,486 feet down that sheer wall, exactly where the account said it should be. They also found a ventilation tunnel that looked like a way into the complex behind it. They did not get in. The tunnel was blocked, and it was not blocked by a rockfall. It was blocked with cement blocks. Somebody had carried building materials to a hole halfway down a cliff face inside a restricted zone and sealed it. And beside it were platforms rigged with mountaineering gear, not their equipment. Somebody else's, already in position. Think about what that takes. Materials moved down a cliff, people working at height for days, all of it inside airspace and ground that civilians are arrested for entering, and not one word of it on any public record. That is not a hoaxer. That is an operation. And it raises a question with no comfortable answer. If there is nothing down there, and there never was, then who spent the time, the money, and the effort to close a hole in a cliff that officially does not lead anywhere? Which side of this do you fall on? The official position has never shifted. There is no underground city in the Grand Canyon. There are no mummies. The Smithsonian says no such expedition was ever funded, and no such professor ever worked there. At the same time, all exploration and mapping of that area is banned, and the ban is enforced. The stated reason is safety, and it is a fair argument. That terrain genuinely kills people. Hidden crevices, narrow passages, sheer drops with no room for a mistake. The government says it is protecting the public from a place that would happily swallow them. But this is exactly where Rogan's objection bites. It cannot just be dangerous, because you can walk into any dangerous area in this country. Go to the normal tourist rim, and the warning is be careful. People fall 2 a year. Nobody closes it. Nobody sends aircraft. And what bothers him most is not even the closure. It is that nobody asks why. That reason has to carry a lot of weight. It has to explain the sealed tunnel. It has to explain the rigging platforms. It has to explain 2 men vanishing mid-expedition and an institution that went from funding the search to denying it ever happened. So opinion splits almost exactly down the middle. Half of the people who hear this reach, reasonably, for the word nonsense. The other half look at cement in a cliff face and see a cover-up that has simply outlasted everyone's patience. What neither side can do is check. That is the whole problem, and it is why this argument has run for more than a century without moving an inch. Every other historical dispute in the world eventually gets settled by somebody going and looking. Nobody can settle this one because settling it would mean going in. And going in is the one thing that is illegal. So here is what we will leave you with. Which side of this divide do you find yourself on, and is there any credibility to these findings at all? Tell us honestly in the comments.